In 1961, a room full of the smartest, most credentialed people in the United States government looked at a plan that was almost certainly going to fail, and approved it anyway. It was the Bay of Pigs invasion. Nearly everyone in that room had private doubts. Almost nobody said a word. That single fact, not the plan itself, but the silence around it, is one of the most studied moments in the history of decision-making, and the psychologist who studied it gave the pattern a name that's since become almost too familiar to notice how strange it actually is: groupthink. Here's what was really happening in that room, according to Irving Janis, the psychologist who spent years reconstructing it. Groupthink isn't stupidity. It isn't a lack of intelligence or expertise. The Bay of Pigs planning group had plenty of both. It's what happens when a tight-knit group starts to value internal agreement more than it values being right. Once that shift happens, something subtle takes over the room. Members start quietly editing their own doubts before they ever reach their mouths. Not because anyone told them to, but because raising a doubt starts to feel less like contributing information and more like breaking ranks, an act of disloyalty to the group, rather than a contribution to the decision. Once enough people are doing that same quiet self-editing at the same time, the group ends up staring at what looks like unanimous support. Everyone sees everyone else nodding along and concludes the plan must be sound, because surely somebody would have objected if it weren't. Nobody realizes that everyone else in the room is running exactly the same calculation, and that the nodding isn't agreement, it's mutual silence being mistaken for consensus by everyone at once. Janis didn't just describe the feeling of it. He identified specific, recognizable symptoms, and they're worth naming individually because you will recognize at least one of them from a room you've sat in yourself. There's an illusion of invulnerability, a sense, rarely spoken aloud, that this group is too smart, too capable, or too well positioned to fail, which breeds a kind of excessive optimism that quietly waves off ordinary caution. There's rationalization when a piece of information shows up that contradicts the group's assumptions. Instead of updating the plan, the group finds a reason the contradicting information doesn't really count, doesn't really apply here, or came from a source that isn't credible anyway. And there are what Janis called self-appointed mind guards people, often without any formal authority to do so, who take it on themselves to shield the leader or the group from unwelcome information, on the theory that raising it would just create unnecessary friction or undermine confidence at a bad time. None of these symptoms require anyone to be malicious or even particularly weak-willed. They emerge naturally out of cohesion itself. The very thing that makes a group feel like a strong team is the same thing that can make it dangerous at the exact moment it needs to hear the truth. That's the part worth sitting with, because it inverts the intuitive story about what causes bad group decisions. The intuitive story says dysfunction comes from teams that don't get along, that argue too much, that lack trust in each other. Janis's actual finding runs almost the opposite direction. It's precisely the teams that get along well, that trust each other, that have worked together long enough to feel like a real unit, that are most exposed to this specific failure mode. A group of strangers who don't particularly like or respect one another has no cohesion to protect, so disagreement doesn't feel costly in the same way there's no shared identity at stake in speaking up. A group that has built something real together has exactly that at stake, every time someone considers voicing a doubt. The very quality that makes a team pleasant to work on, and often genuinely effective on the easy calls, becomes a liability the moment the group faces one specific kind of decision: high stakes, real uncertainty, and pressure to move fast. Now think about your own last big team decision, honestly, for a second. Not a small operational call, a real one, a plan with genuine risk attached to it, where the room reached a decision that everyone appeared to support. Ask yourself the specific question that actually matters here. Did everyone in that room actually agree, or did everyone just stay quiet? Those are not the same event, even though from the outside and often from the inside too, they look identical. A meeting that ends with no objections raised looks exactly the same whether the room is genuinely unanimous or whether it's full of people who each independently decided the cost of speaking up wasn't worth it. You cannot tell the difference from the outcome alone. You can only tell the difference by actively checking, which almost nobody does, because a meeting that ends smoothly doesn't feel like it needs checking. It's worth being precise about why this particular kind of silence is so easy to misread, because the mechanism is subtler than simple fear of a boss's temper. Nobody in that room necessarily believes the leader would punish disagreement. Most of the time, nothing that explicit is even happening. What's happening is a much quieter social calculation running underneath conscious awareness. Speaking up carries a real, immediate, visible cost. You might be wrong. You might look like you're not a team player. You might slow things down when everyone else clearly wants to move forward, while staying silent carries no visible cost at all. At least not today, not in this meeting, not to you personally. The bad outcome from staying silent, if it happens, is diffuse, delayed, and shared across the whole group rather than landing on any one person who chose not to speak. Weigh an immediate personal cost against a diffuse, delayed, shared cost, and silence wins the calculation almost every time, for almost every individual in the room, even when every one of them would tell you, if you asked privately afterward, that they had real doubts. There's also a specific twist to this that makes the plan itself worse than the sum of the individual doubts inside it. Because everyone assumes everyone else's silence signals agreement, the group doesn't just fail to hear objections, it actively overestimates its own confidence in the plan. Each silent person unintentionally becomes evidence, in every other person's eyes, that the plan is more solid than any individual actually believes it to be. The group ends up more confident, collectively, than any single member is individually, which is precisely backwards from what you'd want out of a room full of experts pooling judgment. The whole point of gathering smart people in one room is supposed to be that their combined judgment beats any one person's. Groupthink flips that arithmetic. The room's apparent confidence exceeds what's actually held by anyone inside it, because the confidence is manufactured out of misread silence rather than genuine agreement. Part of why this trap is so easy to fall into has to do with something as ordinary as speaking order, and it's almost embarrassingly simple once you see it. A confident leader who speaks first, and speaks with conviction, doesn't need to intend to suppress debate for debate to get suppressed anyway. The moment the most senior, most confident voice in the room stakes out a clear position, everyone who might have disagreed is now facing a different question than, what do I actually think about this plan? They're facing, am I willing to be the person who contradicts the boss in front of everyone right now? Junior staff in particular read the room fast. Reading rooms accurately is practically a survival skill early in a career, and what they read is that disagreement here carries a visible social cost, while silence carries none. So they stay quiet, not because they lack a view, but because staying quiet is the individually rational move, even when it's collectively disastrous. Multiply that calculation across everyone in the room below the most senior voice, and you get a meeting that looks unanimous purely by construction, regardless of what anyone actually believes walking in. Seniority isn't the only thing that anchors a room this way either. It's just the most obvious one. Speed does the same thing. A plan presented with visible momentum, already treated by its proponents as essentially decided, creates the same pressure on a room full of equals that a confident senior voice creates on a room full of juniors. Objecting to something that already feels settled requires a person to be willing to be the one who slows everything down, publicly, in front of people who seem eager to move. That's a real social cost independent of anyone's rank, and it's part of why urgency and groupthink travel together so often in the real world. A genuine deadline, a real competitive pressure, a crisis atmosphere. All of it compresses the time available for doubt to surface, and compressed time is exactly the condition under which people default to assuming everyone else has already vetted what they're nervous about raising themselves. Here's the pivot in this story that almost nobody remembers, even though it's arguably the more important half of it. Kennedy didn't just absorb the Bay of Pigs as an embarrassing loss and move on with the same decision-making process intact. He actually changed how his own team made decisions, and the test came fast, just about a year later, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, a situation with dramatically higher stakes than the one before it. This time, Kennedy deliberately restructured how his advisors talked to each other. He split them into separate, smaller groups instead of one large room, so that positions could form somewhat independently instead of all forming under the gravitational pull of the same senior voices in the same space. He explicitly asked people to argue against the plan currently in favor, on purpose, as an assigned role rather than a personal risk, which matters enormously, because it changes disagreement from something an individual has to volunteer to a task the group has legitimized and expects. And in a detail that's almost strange to picture, given how central the president was to the decision, he sometimes physically left the room, specifically so that people would speak more freely without his presence shaping what they felt safe saying. That crisis, by most accounts the closest the 20th century came to nuclear war, ended without one. The plan wasn't smarter people in the room. It was largely the same people. What changed was the structure they were forced to operate inside. It's worth noticing exactly how each specific change Kennedy made maps onto exactly one of the failure symptoms from a year earlier, because the fix wasn't some vague instruction to be more open to disagreement. It was targeted. Splitting the advisors into separate groups directly interrupted the mechanism where one confident voice sets the tone for an entire room. Smaller groups meant more people had to actually form and voice an independent view before hearing everyone else's. Assigning someone to argue against the plan directly countered the rationalization symptom, because now there was a designated, legitimized voice whose entire job was to surface the objections that would otherwise have gotten quietly explained away. And leaving the room himself directly addressed the mind guard problem, because a mind guard's whole function is protecting the leader from unwelcome information. Remove the leader from the room, even briefly, and there's nothing left for a mind guard to guard against. None of it was accidental. Each piece of the redesign was aimed at a specific, previously identified failure point, which is exactly why it's a genuinely useful structure for you to borrow rather than just an inspiring anecdote to admire from a distance. That's the real lesson sitting underneath all of this. And it's worth stating plainly because it cuts against the instinct most organizations default to. When a decision goes badly, the near-automatic response is to look for smarter people, better credentials, more expertise in the room next time. But the Bay of Pigs room already had exceptional expertise in it. The problem wasn't the intelligence of the people, it was the structure of how they were allowed to interact with each other and with a confident leader's opinion. You can staff a room with the sharpest people available and still get groupthink, because groupthink isn't a capability failure, it's what happens to good judgment under specific social conditions, and those conditions are fixable independent of who's sitting at the table. So here's what that actually looks like in practice. Before your next genuinely important decision, the kind with real consequences attached if it goes wrong, assign someone, explicitly, out loud, to argue the opposing case not as a punishment, not as a trap, but as a named role the group has agreed makes the decision better. Ask the most junior person in the room to speak first, before the most senior voice has had a chance to anchor everyone else's read of what the acceptable opinion is. And pay close attention to what silence actually means in the room, rather than defaulting to the comfortable interpretation. Silence is not consensus. It has never reliably meant consensus in that room in 1961, or in any room since. Treat it as a signal that tells you to dig further, to ask a direct question, to go around the table individually if you have to, not as a green light that tells you the decision is safe to move on. My own honest take, watching how often this gets talked about versus how rarely it actually gets implemented, is that most leaders treat assign a devil's advocate as a nice idea for someone else's meeting rather than a real change to their own. It gets nodded at in a leadership seminar and then quietly dropped the moment an actual high-stakes decision shows up, because in the heat of a real deadline it feels like exactly the kind of process overhead a confident team doesn't need. That's precisely backwards. The moment it feels most unnecessary when the room is aligned, the deadline is real, and everyone already seems to agree is the exact moment the structure is doing its most important work, because that's the moment ordinary conversation is least likely to surface a real objection on its own. There's a broader habit worth building out of all this, beyond any single meeting technique. Before ratifying any decision that carries real consequences if it's wrong, it's worth explicitly asking the room a version of the question Kennedy's later process was built around. Has anyone here actually been tasked with finding the holes in this? Or has everyone just been quietly hoping the holes don't exist? If the honest answer is that nobody has been assigned that job, The apparent agreement in the room isn't evidence the plan is sound. It's evidence the plan hasn't actually been tested yet, only agreed to. The unsettling part of this whole story is how ordinary it feels from the inside while it's happening. Nobody in that 1961 room felt like they were participating in a historic failure of judgment. It felt like a normal meeting that ended in agreement, the way meetings are supposed to end. That's exactly what makes it worth remembering the warning sign was never going to announce itself. The only defense that actually works is building a structure that makes the quiet doubts speak before the room agrees, not after it's already too late to matter. If this kind of thing is useful to you, go ahead and subscribe. Expect a fresh one weekly.